Hello. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Our remit, National Museums Liverpool, is to make everyone welcome. And that means that we are trying to respond to all of our visitors, our international and national, but also all our local communities as well. So when we're thinking about the kinds of exhibitions that we put on here and the kind of content that we're doing here, we're always thinking about how we can interact with local communities, how we can engage with them, and how can we can respond to what they're asking for. All of our galleries have always been themed, and that's always worked for us in the past, so we carried on with that idea. And we basically just decided how we would theme our different galleries. So in the Museum of Liverpool, we have People's Republic, which deals with the last kind of 2.5 centuries of social change. We have Port City, which deals with Liverpool as a port and how the port has impacted on the city and how the city has impacted on the port. We had Global, which is at the moment just being refurbished, and that looks at Liverpool's relationship with the world and the world's relationship with Liverpool. And then we have Wondrous Place, which was originally going to be called Creative City, which is basically the creative output of the people of Liverpool. So it's kind of everything from writing and painting and dress designing through to sport. So Wondrous Place was decided on fairly early. From about 2005 we started our consultation, and I think the estimate is that we consulted with about 10,000 people on what should go into their museum. The other thing about Liverpool, not just us, but all of the National Museum Liverpool venues that seems to be different from, say, one of the bigger venues in London, is the ownership of the museum. The people of Liverpool know that they own this collection, it's theirs. The two things that were absolutely obvious for the Wondrous Place Gallery were music and sport. It's an international museum. Liverpool is known internationally for music and sport. It's the Beatles and it's Liverpool Football Club. We have to acknowledge that, but local people were coming back with a completely different response. They were saying, we don't just want it to be about the Beatles, we don't just want it to be about Liverpool Football Club. So then you have to kind of get that balance right, which was quite difficult. So the timeline for this museum is, Museum of Liverpool Life opened in '93, it closed in 2006. We then opened this museum in 2011 with Wondrous Place, the original gallery. In 2017, we did something unprecedented. We closed a whole gallery in the museum, which we'd never done before. We change out bits of the museum all the time, but we closed an entire gallery to make way for an exhibition called Double Fantasy, John and Yoko. And I was actually working on a different role at that time, but I was seconded across and I worked on the exhibition. That was on, it was meant to be on for 9 months, it was on for 18 months in the end. It's seriously popular. And then the plan was that we would just put we'd just whack it back in. No changes, just shove it back in, it'd all be great, it'd all look fab. That didn't happen. The first thing was that we realised that just by the very nature of the material, it's popular culture, and that's just not going to work. So we had to update things that had gone out of date. There were some things that needed to be changed because they weren't working anymore. There were other elements that just felt like they just needed a little bit of a zhuzh. And then there were other elements where we felt that in the beginning, when we'd done it in 2011, we hadn't maybe managed to tell a diverse enough story or an accessible enough story for that subject. So those things we could revisit, we had time to revisit. The worst bit of it was that the entire project happened in lockdown. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about what we put in Wondrous Place and why it's there. And for Wondrous Place, before we had stars with names on, and we just decided that because we have such a diverse number of creative people, we wanted to just visually get that across. So we went with images instead of names, just so that people could have an understanding of how many different people there are. We already have a running list of the things we need to change on this wall because people have already sort of said, well, what about that person? What about that person? And if I'm being honest, there's our wondrous people, which is what we're calling these, our wondrous faces. There's about 300 of these in the gallery where it's just an image and a name. You could put 2 noughts on that and we still would be able to fill it. So yeah, the idea is that we can keep updating this over time and change out people, but there'll always be people that have to be on here. So the Beatles are the obvious ones. And yeah, but just trying to get some people in that are kind of a little bit quirky that people maybe don't know. I mean, Lottie Dodd is fabulous. She was an Olympian. She was just a massive overachiever, and I really wanted her in. But we also included people like Faith Bebbington, who is known to local community, but she won't be known to any of our international visitors, but that doesn't mean she doesn't belong on our wall. So yeah, we kind of tried to get a really good mix, but it's an ongoing thing and it will keep changing over time, and we'll keep adding to it, and we'll keep moving people around. But hopefully without losing any of the content. There's certainly quite a few people on here at the moment who are also featured in the gallery, so those are our starting points for when we change them out. We didn't just start from scratch and go, right, we're going to put all of this in and we know what we're going to do. We actually, when we knew that we were developing the Museum of Liverpool, we actually staged an exhibition in 2008 off-site in a different museum called The Beat Goes On. And we worked with the Institute of Popular Music and various other music groups, really, to establish what we should be putting in the museum and what, as I say, we've done a lot of consultation by that point, and we knew that people were saying that they wanted the Beatles, but they didn't just want the Beatles. But the Institute of Popular Music and our other colleagues were really helpful in kind of thinking about the academic storylines and what we should be saying about Liverpool. Obviously we should be talking about the Beatles, and that means we should be talking about Mersey Beat in connection, but what else do we need to do? And the Institute had identified that there were these sights and scenes that were really key in Liverpool's music history, and so the three sights and scenes that we focused on for The Beat Goes On were Mersey Beat and Cavern and Matthew Street, Eric's, which was punk post-punk, and Eric's was also in Matthew Street and that surrounding area of Probe Records, etc. And then Dance, and that's kind of Quadrant Park and Cream right through to kind of present day. When we started to think about this exhibition in 2018, I went back to Marion and I was saying, look, should we be thinking about another sight and scene now, or are we there? And she said, although other music has come up and other different musical tastes and styles and genres have developed, those are still the three key sights and scenes. So we focus on those within the gallery in three areas, and we still tell the story that we had in The Beat Goes On. Now, when you're thinking about an exhibition, there are two kind of parallel routes. So the first thing that you're thinking about is what you want to tell, what stories you'd really like to tell and what you feel needs to be in the exhibition. And the other route is what you can tell, what your resources are. So your starting point is your own collection. For us, not massive. We had to do quite a lot of active collecting when we started, and probably of all of the galleries, Wondrous Place has more loaned material from other lenders than it does from our own collections. And that meant that our team at the time had to do a massive amount of work making those connections, finding out who had what and what was visible and what was available and kind of what was usable. But our own collections, if you kind of got the starting point of your own collections, it means that sometimes you can tell some quirky stories that you wouldn't maybe have told if you were just going down the academic route. So it's a kind of balance between the two. We have in our own collections a huge amount of memorabilia, and that memorabilia tells a certain story. But we didn't have a lot of kind of the Beatles' life story. It was all about memorabilia and fans collecting items. Our back case at that time had this massive amount of memorabilia, but it was all pretty much telling one story. So when we came to 2018, we needed a bit more space to tell other stories. So what we actually did, and this is a bit contentious, we kind of squished up the Beatles and Mersey Beat into the one display. And some people will say that that's fine, and other people will say that's not right, and that the Beatles are not Mersey Beat, and that they, although they came out of Mersey Beat, they don't necessarily belong there. So it's a bit of a contentious one. What we also knew was that we didn't have any female stories. I think we had one picture of Scylla. So our aim when we were opening again from 2018, when we started to think about this, and when we opened in 2021, was to try and get some female stories in there. It's not as easy as you think. You can't just kind of go, let's just go out there and see who's still around. It doesn't always work that way. But we were able to make the connections. What we actually did was we found one of the Liverbirds, the group The Liverbirds, we found one of their band members on social media. And we approached her on social media and said, look, could we please tell your story? So we have the Liverbirds in. We also don't have a massive diverse story, and we know that in parallel to Mersey Beat, there was a black music kind of hub in Liverpool 8 that was going on. There were a lot of clubs where live music was being played, and the Beatles talk about going there. And although a lot of the black community didn't come out of that Liverpool 8 and they didn't come into the Mersey Beat sort of city centre area, there was a crossover at times. And we wanted to tell that story. We haven't done as well as we could have done with that. We've expanded and we're now telling a bit more than we did before. And you'll see in the case that we talk about the chants and we talk about some of the other groups that are around, but we didn't manage it in the way that we wanted to, and that's something for me to still work on. The good thing is that the way that our cases are designed, we actually can keep updating. We moved some stuff around. Our Roots case had been a bigger display and we condensed it a little. Again, this is stuff where We talk about the musical roots of Merseyside and where some of that those music influences come from. And so that's our own collections. We had a lot of that material in our own collections, but we were still able to add a little bit. We have probably one of our star objects, I'd say, and it appeared in our Double Fantasy exhibition as well, is the John Lennon bedspread. At that point we purchased the bedspread, and so that was always going to be a star object. It makes the display a little John heavy, and that was a big discussion that we had, whether we wanted it to be more John and less about the other three Beatles. But it's such an amazing object that we felt it needed to be in there. How we develop with that in the future, I'm not quite sure. We had an amazing Eric's display in the old museum, in the old version of this gallery. While most of it is loaned, we were still able to keep most of it. Music culture, people's collecting of music. The way that the museums generally collect the material they have is that people donate to us. They donate their material when they either can't home it anymore, or if kind of another family member inherits it and they offer it to us. But some of our lenders here, so Norman the DJ for instance, has been loaning his material to us for 14 years. That's a lot of trust and a really good relationship that we have to maintain. At any point Norman can say, I'd like my stuff back, in which case we would say yes, of course. But he's just been really great, and those relationships are really, they're really important that we maintain those. Some other stuff, people over time, it spends so long in the museum that in the end people just say, look, you can have it in your collections. It's doing much better being seen by the public than it would be if it was at home in my back bedroom. The dance stuff we'd had, the exhibition that we had before, we had mostly cream, because that's what we'd been able to make that connection for. But we knew that we wanted to expand that. We knew that we wanted to expand the early dance scene, because we had photos of Quadrant Park, but we didn't really have anything that was kind of physically representative. So that was something that we knew that we had to chase. And the other thing is that, unlike the other scenes where it's kind of a period in time, you still have fans of punk and post-punk, and you still have fans of Mersey Beat, and there are still acts who are playing live for those. The dance scene has kind of evolved and continued to sort of have a story to tell. So for the dance scene, we had to think about how we could do that and how we could look at the contemporary story. All of our galleries, we have cases called Our City, Our Stories. And this is a community project-led device that we use, where we connect with either a community group or an individual, and we use a format to create a display. It's not always necessarily, actually, it's not always a display. Sometimes it can be a digital film, sometimes it can be a series of events. But the idea is that a community group or an individual can come to us with a really great story to tell, and we can make it happen in the museum at fairly short notice sometimes. This gallery didn't really have that open to it in the earlier format that we had, but we now have 6 cases around the whole gallery, 2 in the music section. And the Black to the Future was the first one that we focused on. We have these relationships that we've been developing for years, and sometimes we just want to give people the opportunity to have their say. So Writing on the Wall was a group that we'd worked with who were in our stage and screen display, and the Liverpool Heritage Development Company were another group that we'd worked with. They'd had an exhibition in the Central Library called Black to the Future. They'd actually done 2. The other one was Black Punch, about boxing. And we approached them and we were like, look, we've got this case. You basically have a case, a graphic panel, and a digital label. What would you like to do? And they come back to us and they worked with us to co-curate a display. In the library, it had all been archival, it had all been 2D, and while that sometimes does work in the museum, we do like to try and kind of make sure that we get objects in there, physical objects. So we've developed some of the stuff from the library. The plan for this display was always that I would have to do minimal work on this. I actually ended up doing more work on this than probably any of the other displays. But it meant that we were able to open out the story. So their Black to the Future display had talked about the black history, black musical history, and how black music had come into Liverpool. So they were focused on early black musicians, people like Paul Robeson, Duke Ellington, even going back so far as the minstrel dancing groups, which included freed slaves. So we told that story, but we wanted to kind of pull it up to present day. So Again, there was no female story really in there clearly defined, so we wanted to look at kind of people like Rebecca Ferguson. There's a singer in America called Marsha Ambrosius, who's from Liverpool, who is a #1 singer in the States, but nobody from Liverpool has ever heard from her. So we wanted to get her story in there. The Valentino's costume was it was red with wings, and it had been on Opportunity Knocks, and then it arrived and it was blue and it looked nothing like the costume that we'd expected, so that needed a little bit of change, and it has a very slim waist, so our mannequin, we had to saw bits of our mannequin off to be able to get the costume on the mannequin. We have Gary Christian's iconic cap and glasses. I'd arranged with Gary's wife to collect the cap and glasses, and that was all great and it was all fabulous, and then she'd gone away to do it on a business trip, and we went to Gary to pick them up, and he was like, oh, I couldn't find them, so I gave you that. And I've got you these, and he gave some other items to my colleague, and because I was at home with COVID, because this was during lockdown, my colleague just took what he gave her and brought it back, and it was a pair of jeans, and I was like, well, that's not going in the case, I've got a little space in the top right hand corner here. And so then I had to kind of, I think it was 3 trips to Gary's house before we actually ended up with the items that we were expecting and that we'd discussed. But that stuff happens. People kind of, they say, oh, we've got this. So for the jumpsuit, it was, oh, we've got this costume in the attic. And we make a whole plan about it, and our designers draw it all up. And then when the costume comes out of the attic, it's not quite what they thought it was. But it's great, and the costume that we got is amazing. So we're really pleased about that. But yeah, just working with the community group. It takes a little bit longer because everything that you do, you then have to go back to them and make sure they're happy with, because we would never tell a story that they weren't happy with. We have contracts, and in our contracts it says we get the final say, but the reality is that when you're working with a group like this, you don't want to have the final say, you want them to have the final say, you want them to make the decision about their story. We went to Sonic Youth and we were like, do you want to work with us? And they were just absolutely made up. Again, we said to them, you have a case this size, you have a graphic panel, you have 2 graphic panels, and in this case they said they'd wanted to show a film. What we actually got was enough material from them to fill 4 cases, I think. And that happens, you know, people really, really want to tell their story and they want to tell it to the best of their ability. In the end, through a lot of negotiation, we were able to kind of come up with the key objects that they thought best told their story. And they've just been, they're just stunning. I mean, the wig is just, it arrived and we were like, oh my God, that is amazing. But yeah, it's a really nice story, and it's really upbeat, and it's a really positive way to tell an LGBT plus story, which is really important to us. I talked to you earlier on about how we want to be accessible to as many people as we can. And so in the music gallery, we couldn't have opened the music gallery without trying to tell the stories of different communities from all sorts of different places. This is the Museum of Liverpool. At the end of the day, everything that we display in here is about the Museum of Liverpool. If it doesn't connect to the Museum of Liverpool, then it doesn't belong here. And so for the Beatles, very early on we decided that the key story for us and the thing that made us different was that Liverpool story. So the film that we have, which is a fully 360 immersive film about the Beatles, it lasts about 20 minutes. It does tell the story of the Beatles, the whole story, but the majority of it is focused on their Liverpool story. And we go all the way back to when they were born and what Liverpool was like as a city when they were born. And that's very deliberate. The other things that we have in the gallery that we've not really talked about is Liverpool is a #1 hit city. It's famously, it was a #1 hit city. So we wanted to just try and get that feel for the different genres that were happening. It's an ongoing process. And I think that's kind of probably it for the tour. Oh, don't do that. No, stop, no.